Elizabeth,
presenting too much.
well, and Elizabeth's going to be here, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then,
I'll just have her as my delegate. Is that okay?
yeah, definitely,
And
definitely.
then just call me at any point. I'll be in the car for like
Okay.
7 or 8 hours.
Okay, oh,
All right.
okay, thank you. Is my microphone on? Yes. We're ready to call the workshop back to order. If everyone could be in their seats. Thank you all very much. The next item on the agenda is English as a Second Language ESL program policy updates from Ms. Jan Lanier and Ms. Katie Barcy. Are they here? Yes. Hi, how are you?
So much for having myself and Jan in today to talk a little bit more about the ESL program policy changes that we have put forth for final reading. So before we begin, I just wanted to kind of discuss a little bit how our work more broadly and then this proposal specifically fits into the new framework of our new strategic plan at the department, Best for All. And so looking at academics more specifically, our work supporting English learners really works to ensure that they have equitable access to their coursework and any subsequent academic and non-academic opportunities. And under educators, we will talk a little bit later at the end of the presentation about some of the ideas we've gotten from educators through feedback, as well as some other pieces that we're trying to put together to support educators in this effort. And we do know that there are a lot of issues related to providing all these services for students. And then finally, under Whole Child, our proposal more specifically is looking to build an exit pathway for our students who receive ESL services but also take alternate assessments. And so we know that this is really crucial to providing those necessary supports for our students with exceptionalities. And so with all of that in mind, I will remind you all of our proposed revisions that we have. Our major revisions include establishing an exit criteria for students who take the WIDA alternate access at a composite of P1 or higher and a literacy score of P1 or higher. And this is establishing the criteria. So this is that first time that we're setting exit criteria for them. And then for our students who take the WIDA access, we are proposing to raise the exit criteria to a 4.4 composite and a 4.2 literacy. And as a reminder, they are currently at a 4.2 composite and a 4.0 literacy. So those are the revisions that we're really going to dive into. And I noticed a lot of feedback from our educators that I do want to touch on, and when we talk about how we engaged stakeholders. So we pursued a very passionate campaign of getting a lot of stakeholder feedback around this, as you all rightly suggested last time. So we went through and we released a statewide survey back in August, and that survey was shared in the federal programs update, which goes out more broadly to anybody working in federal programs and districts, which would include Title III directors, ESL supervisors. We also shared the survey with our ESL regional advisors, who are our 8 full-time district staff that we contract to provide support for districts. And so those are people in districts who have a lot more touch points with their other fellow colleagues in districts and teachers in schools. So they were also part of that process in getting that survey out. And additionally, we communicated it at pretty much any event, any presentation that we had during that time window. We also engaged in some regional professional learning communities in focus groups. So we did most of the listening, touched briefly on what our suggestions were, and then got a lot of feedback from educators at different regional PLCs across the state. And at the Federal Programs and Oversight Advisory Council meeting that we had in September, we engaged all the stakeholders there. We presented the policy, we let them share their feedback, we did a bunch of brainstorming sessions, and that advisory council is composed of people in a variety of roles in different districts all across the state. And in addition to that, we also got feedback collected from our ESL regional advisors, and we informed them to just reach out to any stakeholders that they knew who would be really important in providing feedback. So we trusted their judgment to contact teachers, parents, fellow colleagues, and educators to gather any type of feedback that they got on the policy. And we got all of that feedback en masse. So there could very well be feedback from additional stakeholders like parents, et cetera, in that group. But it wasn't disaggregated out by who said what and what their role was. But we took all of that feedback and gathered it. And finally, we reached out to different advocacy organizations in late July, early August, and we got some feedback back in October from them. And so we have reached out to pretty much everybody we can to get as much information around what their thoughts are and suggestions are. And from that, we actually got a few really great pieces of feedback that we've now added. In addition, you'll notice that there are some changes between the first reading and second reading, minor, but they came from that feedback. And we'll touch on that at the end. So at a high level, what was the feedback from engagement? There was support for this incremental raising of criteria. We're not asking to change the exit criteria from 4.2 to 5.0. People really felt that that slower incremental changing of exit criteria was something that was a lot more manageable and made more sense. But we do want to note that many teachers felt that the students who are exiting at our current criteria are performing adequately in their classes. And so we really wanted to take that piece of feedback and explore it more deeply, and you'll see that in the subsequent slides where we really look into that. And then we found across the board strong support for the WIDA access, alternate access exit criteria. We didn't find anybody who was opposed to raising or establishing that exit criteria. And then finally, as you all echoed during our last meeting, there are concerns around the availability and staffing of ESL teachers. And so that is a big piece of feedback that we heard. And so we'll touch on that a little bit at the end, some efforts that we've been trying to do to help alleviate some of those concerns with the tools that we have available. So I really want to structure a lot of this around the concerns that you all had and the issues you wanted us to touch on from first reading. And when looking at all of that, we really broke it down into student level types of concerns and then district level types of concerns. So at the student level, there was a great question about what is the difference in English language proficiency between the current exit criteria and the proposed exit criteria. The idea of a 4.2 and a 4.4 can feel really nebulous. So like, what does that actually mean? And so we'll look at that. And then what does that difference actually look like for students in their content area classes? So we can talk about a 4.2 and a 4.4, but for a student taking social studies, for example, what does that difference look like? And then at the district level, what sort of funding and supports are available for these changes due to the shifting exit criteria? So there were concerns about the fact that we will have more English learners when we raise the exit criteria because there will be fewer students exiting. That's just a reality. So that means that we may have to have more teachers. So what funding is available to support that? And then what are the supports for ESL-related staffing to meet those increased needs? And so we'll touch on those at the very end of the presentation as well. But I'm just giving you a little roadmap to what we have. So looking at student level impact, how do Tennessee English learners fare nationally when we're comparing ourselves to other WIDA states? And so this graph that you see here, on the y-axis, you have the WIDA Access composite scores required for exit from ESL services for other states that administer the WIDA. And you'll see Tennessee is in red, and our neighboring states are in blue, and all of the other WIDA states are in gray there. And you'll see that Tennessee here is actually the lowest out of all of our neighboring states in terms of where we set our exit criteria. So to interpret this in Alabama, for example, you need a 4.8 to exit from ESL services, and in Missouri, a 4.7, and in Georgia, a 5 to exit from ESL. So we're saying students at a 4.2 exit, and that puts us the lowest among our peers in the Southeast region, and one of the lowest out of all of the other WIDA states in the country. And so then looking at a comparison nationally, how our students fare on the NAEP, we reached out to our research
Mr.
team
Edwards
and they
has
actually—
a class. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Edwards has a question.
Of
for you.
course.
So, given fact that we're in that position compared, what would be the difficulty in escalating that rather than doing it incrementally from 4.2 to where 5 or wherever it should be?
So what we talked about last time is we looked at how many students wouldn't meet that exit criteria. That number, if we increased it, there would just be a greater number of English learners who wouldn't be exiting from services. And I'm speaking generally because I don't have the exact numbers.
So it would mean it'd be easier on us.
It would be, what would happen is that we would have a greater number of English learners, and then districts would have more students to provide ESL services for, and more teachers that they would need to hire, more ESL teachers that they would need to have in place to provide those services.
But if that were to happen, those students would be better served.
Those students would receive ESL services until they had a more advanced WIDA score. So looking at where our English learners are on NAEP, you can see down at the bottom there, our English learners are down there. And when speaking with our research team, they actually provided us a really helpful insight in saying that there's actually a logical argument for why Tennessee's relatively low exit criteria might be part of the reason why our English learners are in that bottom 10%, because if you think about it, what we're doing is we're essentially comparing Tennessee's English learners, who are by definition scoring less than a 4.2, with other states whose English learners might be a 4.4 or a 4.6. So that comparison is just by definition different, which might be why our students are lower when compared nationally. So moving away from that kind of high level, looking at that more specific piece of, we talk about 4.2, 4.4, what does that mean exactly? This is not an easy question to answer, but I spent some time looking through all of the different resources and felt that there's a helpful way to think about it through the lens of WIDA can-do descriptors. And so what you'll see here is a chart for the level 4 on the WIDA. And you'll notice that we have all of the different domains on there. We have listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and underneath each of those domains, there's specific tasks and actions that students should be able to do to qualify under that. And so you could imagine a student who is a 5 would be able to do all of these different pieces. They would be proficient at all of those different tasks in order to move out of the level 4 into the next level. Now, when we look at what a 4.2 would be, if we assume that if a student can do all of those, they are a level 5. A 4.2 might be a portion of them. So if you look at the next slide with the red highlighted pieces, just a subset of those would qualify as a 4.2. And we are saying that if they can do those things, then they're proficient. Now, it's important to note that the reason why this is so difficult is the exact combination of which of these things a student can do will vary from student to student. So it's hard to say a student at a 4.2 can do this and this under speaking, this and this under listening, and be really explicit about it, but it would be that amount of things that they're capable of doing in some permutation across those different domains. But if we look at a 4.4, what we're saying is that we've now dramatically increased the number of things we expect a student to be able to do before we would consider them proficient in English. And again, it doesn't matter exactly which ones of those tasks they can do, it's just the amount of tasks that we're expecting them to do. And then to just go back again, if we said that they were a level 5, they would be able to do all of those things. So that's what the difference between a 4.2 and a 4.4 is, as concretely as you can be with how individual and unique each individual student is. So what then does that difference actually make when we look at how students perform on their content? So what you see here is we have the percent of students who are on track or mastered across 3 different subjects. We have ELA, math, and social studies. And the blue bar represents our students who exit at that 4.2, the percentage of them that are on track or mastered on ELA, for example. And then in the red bar, you have the percentage of students who are on track or mastered at a 4.4 WIDA composite score. So you can see that if students are exiting at a 4.4, there's a greater chance that they will be on track or mastered in different content areas. on the WIDA as opposed to a 4.2, and especially where you see that jump is in ELA. But at a really, really high level, if we were to step out and think about what impact this might have at the student level, really this increased access and participation in academic and non-academic opportunities will be increased because they have greater language proficiency, so they're better able to engage in their courses, they're better able to take advantage of other opportunities that they have, and then they have more access to meaningful interaction with their coursework because their language proficiency is just higher, and so they have that ability to more reasonably access their social studies curriculum or math, for example. So I'm gonna pause for a minute and allow for any questions. If y'all have any questions, I can answer. Ooh.
Mr.
Apparently,
it may
apparently
be
not.
mine, I don't know. Mr. EB has a question.
So this is for grades 3 through 8.
Mhm.
ESL for high school? What?
It looks a little bit different, and also it depends because there's fewer students taking some of the different EOCs, so that it's harder to generalize with that data just because it's a little bit more difficult. And some of the students we have in high school are also newcomers. So those are students who are just coming to the United States. So the data gets a little bit messier when we get to the high school level, but 3-8 kind of captures a better general picture. But you're absolutely correct that there would be some differences at the high school level.
And in the high school, then, would you be looking at ACT scores, or what scores would you be looking at?
We would be looking at like EOC scores and
EOC
subjects.
scores? Okay. Yeah, I think that would be good to continue to track and look at.
Yeah, it gets a little bit hard just because of how, like what courses students end up taking and with some of our high school students. So it's harder to generalize from that data, but we can absolutely
But we're still
look at that.
advocating for high school or 4.2.
Yeah, it would be across the board for all of the
right.
grade levels, yeah.
Is there a chance that you would have a different score for high schools than you would have for, because again, they're closer to leaving, the school system, and you want them better prepared. Why, and because if they are older when they go into those, they're not, they're going to have
Right.
a more difficult time. So why would we not have a different score for high school?
So that's something we have looked at. We have a couple of, it would be a little bit tricky, but we may eventually be able to find a way to work it out. The federal government requires that we have a standardized exit across all students. So it's really hard to kind of figure out how we could have a standardized exit across all students and have it differentiated that way. But it is something that we've thought about before because we do understand at the high school level, circumstances can be dramatically different than they are at the elementary school level. So it's something that we're thinking about. We just kind of have to figure out how. Great. If there's no other questions, I'll move on to district level concerns that you all shared with us. Some of the major concerns that you voiced last time were around funding. So when we think about the fact that we will have more English learners if we raise the exit criteria, so that means there are more students who need ESL services, and given that we have a ratio, there might be more need for ESL teachers. So what kind of funding is available for this? It is important to note that BEP does fund districts for English learners at a ratio of 1:20. But our state board policy requires that they staff at a ratio of 1:35. So there is funding there. And there are about 80 districts that staff over that 1:20 ratio, and around 55 or so that staff at or under that ratio. So we do have districts that are staffing right up to the max at 1:35. So there is BEP funding out there that can be used for this purpose. But then when we think outside of just the funding piece, what kinds of supports are available for the ESL-related staffing issues that we have? We have been working with the licensure team and been starting discussions with them around what tools and resources we can make available. And they put out a very helpful resource back in the late summer, early fall that gathers all of that information about licensure waivers, permits, et cetera. And so what we've done is we've taken that information and really distilled it down to the pieces that are applicable for ESL and have crafted something that's more ESL specific for that, knowing the circumstances that a lot of our districts are in. And so we are in the process of updating the ESL manual, which is the kind of how-to user guide of how to run an ESL program in a district. And we are including all of that information, so it's readily available for anybody in a district who is running an ESL program and has these concerns. They don't have to look through other resources. We've taken it and put it all right there for them. And in addition, we are putting together a webinar that takes that manual, which is a few hundred pages, and condenses it into a nice and easy webinar that they can watch that has all of that information available for them about what are the different pathways. It shares everything up front, because that's something we hear from districts a lot, is we just don't know what our options are for getting teachers that we need. So we took that information and have decided to say, for your specific topic area and content area, this is what you can do to help out in staffing for ESL. And one final additional support that we did propose, you'll notice there was a change between first and second reading. The tailoring of services is something that we really wanted to take some time to delve into, because from the feedback we got from teachers and the feedback on surveys and other things, there were a few pieces that really stood out that we thought were actually really concrete, really good, actionable pieces of information. So we've built that into our proposed changes. When thinking about tailoring of services, we heard over and over again, kindergarten students can't have tailored services, because we had nothing in there about the WIDA WAPT, which is the exam that kindergartners take. There was no mention of scores for that and how you could tailor services for those students. And tailoring of services just means they don't have to have that full hour if they're proficient enough. They're almost at exit. They're really advanced. So it might actually be more detrimental to pull them out of their class with their peers for an hour than it would be to let them be in class with their peers learning. And so they felt that for kindergartners especially, our students who are young and are still learning and growing, that if they're already almost at that cusp, allowing them to have more time in the classroom with their peers would be helpful. And so we decided to make a little tweak to the tailoring of services to say that students who score on that 20 to 27 range, which is right at that top of the WAPT, but just under our cut for exit there with the 28, that those students can have tailored services. And then for students in grades 1 through 12, the way we have the policy written right now is you have to have a 3.5 in all of the domains in order to be able to get less than an hour of services. But some feedback we continued to hear from districts is that we're having a lot of issues with the standard setting with speaking, and that's lowering a lot of students' speaking scores, and it's not necessarily reflective of their actual abilities. So having that flexibility to be able to tailor services for students, not just based on that blunt score, would be helpful. So we changed it to say a 3.5 or above in reading and writing, which we felt were still really important. Students needed to have those skills in literacy, but then giving them the flexibility to choose one of the other domains, speaking or listening, so that if a student might have had a particularly low score in one domain that might not be reflective of where their level actually is, that gives teachers a lot more discretion and flexibility in scheduling those students. And the benefits of that being that that student would have services that might better reflect their actual abilities, and they might have more opportunities in the classroom with their peers. And then on the teacher side, we would be giving teachers a lot more autonomy to provide services and decision-making around their students, because they know their students best. And then more flexibility in scheduling, because if there are fewer students who would necessitate that 1 hour of services, that frees up time for them to provide those services, especially for the kids who aren't exiting because of a raised exit criteria. So all of that are some of the changes in the feedback that we got from our stakeholder engagement across the state. And I open it up to any questions again.
Mr. Eby?
So if the BEP funds at 1 to 20 and some districts do 1 to 35, what happens to those other funds?
I can't answer that. I'm not completely sure. We do, on our consolidated funding application, we're thinking about making changes to ask them more specifically to explain to us what those funds get used for. So
I didn't know if they had the opportunity to use them for other things. If so, where in the legislation does it say that you can use it for other things, or does it? I don't know. Maybe I'll ask our BEP expert over here.
So remember that this is a funding formula, not a spending plan exactly. So what the state provides is a particular amount for certain things. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be spent in that particular way.
Any other questions? No other questions. Thank you.
I'll ask one just
you wanna
briefly.
add
And
something?
first,
Yeah.
thank you, Katie, and
Yeah.
to your team, because I think you've really responded to a lot of the questions that we had from the last meeting. Can you talk just a little bit more about the feedback you're getting in those trainings? Are people feeling good now? I mean, just sort of at the highest level, I mean, it sounds like you've had a lot of engagement and you've got some key takeaways that are informing the changes for final reading, but generally, how are people feeling in the districts about this change and sort of what additionally are they going to need, if anything, to make this happen?
I think in general, people feel that, and they understand that this incremental change is ultimately better than just dramatically changing it in one go, and so they feel okay about that. I think still, just given the ESL staffing concerns that we have across the state, and some of that comes from exit, but a lot of it just comes from an increase in student population. That's the biggest piece of feedback that we're hearing, is that there's a lot of concerns around being able to find and staff ESL teachers. But in general, I think that they feel there's a lot of other tools and resources like ILPs and available, so I think they feel okay about it, and they understand the need for it, but again, it's staffing that is still a major concern.
And we'll continue as a board to work with the department on licensure considerations, for ESL teachers, so that's helpful to know. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all
Appreciate
so
your
much.
hard work. Next on the agenda is the department's updates from the commissioner. Commissioner Swin.
Yes, hello. Amy and I are going to try to make this work long distance.
No problem.
But
Let me just get up the right one right here. Here we go.
Thank you. So we are thrilled to be able to roll out a more comprehensive version of the strategic plan. I know there was also a request from the board to talk a little bit more about the data. So we're expecting to spend the first 20 minutes talking more about the data, stop there and make sure we have time for questions and answers, and spend the remainder of the time talking through the plan. So we're going to break it up in that way. So to start out, in terms of how we structured the plan, the first components were we did a listening tour, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later, a lot of data analysis and comparisons, and then ideation and budgeting. But that did start with the data, and so I'm going to the next slide, want to dive in there. So we're starting with the end, which we're also calling the beginning, especially because as we think about what the vision is for the department and for the state, we are thinking about the purpose of K-12 education and what it's supposed to produce. So spending less time saying that the end point for our students is to generate a specific score, but those are actually checkups along the way towards an outcome we're trying to build for them. And the point of public education is to ensure that when our students graduate with a diploma that means something, they are able to take advantage of the multitude of opportunities in front of them, and that's actually what we are trying to produce. And so we wanted to start with graduation rates for that reason. Our graduation rates, as you can see over time, have been steadily increasing and continue to do so, and so I think we're moving in a really positive direction in that space. Moving forward and spending a little bit more time on the data that we got in 2019. Wanted to start with NAEP. I got a number of questions, I think, from this group around that, and so just want to dive in on what some of those data points said. So first and foremost, NAEP % on grade level. So if you look at the various charts, and I know the gold is a little bit hard to read, but we have math fourth grade proficiency in the...
Excuse
Yep,
me.
sure.
I'm having difficulty reading that, and I was looking for that. Do we have,
I'm going to email to board members. This is an updated version that she's using that I just got today, so I'll email it to you right now and then you can pull it up.
Great. So if you look at the top, and I can narrate, I think, more specifically what those trend lines look like, there's a gold bar that's, I think, slightly hard to see at the top. That's fourth grade math proficiency. What you see in fourth grade math proficiency is that there was a big spike between 2011 and 2013. There was essentially a maintenance of that proficiency, and then a slight decline back up in 2019. So we've essentially recovered back to the point where we were in 2013. So we were one of the only states to see significant growth in fourth grade math in the country this year, which is incredibly positive. Similarly, if you look at the red line, that is math 8th grade proficiency, and then the two lines that are very close together in the middle, which is the kind of the teal and the brown, are reading 4th grade proficiency and reading 8th grade proficiency. Both of those had a similar spike between 2011 and 2013. We've maintained proficiency more in reading in 4th grade, declined a little bit in reading in 8th grade. Again, those trends match what we see on our TCAP assessment. This is, I think, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time. You see the very high proficiency rates, and one of the things that I think Tennessee has been most proud of, rightfully so, is the truth in advertising. And so you see a big disparity between our TCAP test and then the NAEP over a decade ago. The department has worked very closely to get those scores to be more aligned. And so what you see in the dotted line is our proficiency on NAEP. The bold line is our proficiency on the TCAP. Those have become very close together, in many cases overlapping. And so if you look specifically between 2011 and 2019, you'll see a lot of the trend lines between the two tests. Specifically on 4th grade reading, again, a bump that happened between 2011 and 2013. You see a steady decline from there, specifically on TCAP. We're about 35% proficiency in 4th grade reading. 8th grade reading had a similar trend. We had a bump 2011 to 2013, maintenance of proficiency, and have had a decline since then. We're at 27% reading proficiency in 8th grade. If you look at math, we had a steady incline over several years, a slight decline, and then we've recovered from that in 4th grade, and similarly in 8th grade, we are in the process of recovering. I think one of the good stories here is that our math scores continue to increase, and I think that has a lot to do with the support that has been given in districts across the state and higher quality materials being used in classrooms. Next, we had a question to ask us to break out the NAEP, specifically by region. Lately, there's been a lot of attention on the types of regions across the state and what that performance looks like. So again, if you look at gold on the top, that is going to look at our suburban schools. You see that they had the largest jump between 2011 and 2013. It accounted for most of the growth during that time period in both 4th grade reading and 4th grade math. There's been some maintenance in proficiency and another swing upwards over the last 4 years. If you look at city, which is blue on the bottom, you see a similar trend. It has been more of a growth between 2011-13 and maintenance in reading, but what you're seeing in math in 4th grade is something slightly different, and that is a steady increase over time, a slight dip, and then a recovery, which is pretty typical when you have such a sharp increase over time. Where we see less growth over time has specifically been in our town and our rural communities. Those have been generally flat over a long period of time. I think that's something that's been a broader conversation across the state over the last several months and is an area of focus both of this plan and certainly of the administration moving forward. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about proficiency by student group over time. I know there was a member who was interested in what the achievement gap looked like, just for kind of one sample. So we have that for 4th grade reading. That was the requested data point. So you can see there's a number of groups that are represented. The first is our white students. That's going to be the teal line at the very top. Next, you have orange, and that's going to be Hispanic students. Right below that is red, which are going to be those students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. Below that is going to be gold, which are our black students. Underneath that is going to be our students with disabilities and then our English learners. What you can see from the top left-hand graph on 4th grade reading proficiency is that we had a 25 percentage point gap between our white students and our black students and students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. That reduced to 22 percentage points in 2013, but has since expanded back to 25 percentage points in 2019. You see similar trends. Those have gotten actually bigger in 8th grade reading as we've seen more of our declines for non-white students in the state. And then one of the more interesting things that I think is going to be a critically important conversation, especially given the last presentation, is when you look at the performance of our ELLs in the state, you can see that in 2017, we essentially had 0% proficiency in 8th grade math for English learners. That has increased now to just below 5% proficiency. You'll see the same thing, 8th grade reading. We had just under 5% proficiency that's gone down to about 3% proficiency on the NAEP. You see a big bump in reading. We think that's a sample. That's typical when you have a sample size that's slightly different on NAEP. You'll see a bump. It's a particularly high-performing school or set of schools that serve a certain population of students. That's self-corrected back for the last 2 administrations. Next, and this is just a chart This was kind of a fun one to break down, but this was looking at, if you break down each student group as opposed to a collective, how is each student group comparing to other similar student groups by state? So we can see on the left-hand side, it's going to tell you the student group. On the right-hand side, it's going to tell you both the scale score, and then the color coding is to tell you where that falls, whether it's at the advanced level or down to below basic. What you can see is that compared to other states, Black students in Tennessee tend to perform better than most other Black students in other states. However, that performance is still at a 204, which is below basic. So that gives you a state of affairs of our country more than anything else, to be perfectly candid. On the bottom, what you'll see is that our lowest performing group when compared to similar students in other states are our English learners. They have a 176 scale score, which again is below basic. Our three bottom performers are going to be our free reduced lunch eligible students, our Hispanic students, and our English learners when compared to similar students in other states. Those who are right around the average are going to be our white students. White students in Tennessee perform generally in the middle of states. Next.
Sure. I was just
Yep.
going to stop you there, because I know
Sure.
when we were talking about this, you talked about this being sort of the new way that we would compare ourselves in some ways to other states, because historically we've used the NAEP data to talk about sort of where we are in rankings, and I know the press is still using that. Can you just talk a little bit briefly about how you're planning to track progress over time in terms of the relative performance with other states on NAEP?
Sure. So there's the next few slides are also going to do the same thing, but I think for this slide, we're looking at it in two ways. So if you look at the composition of students by state, if you're looking at a state like states like Maine, New Hampshire, some of the Midwestern states, their composition are completely different than a Deep South or an SEC state like Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana. And so one of the things that we're seeing that NAEP actually discourages us from doing overall state rankings for that reason. They encourage to look at how are similar student groups doing. So you know, for example, how are Black students in state A doing compared to Black students in state B. It gives you a more accurate, though I wouldn't say 100% accurate, view of comparative metrics. And so we want to be able to track. We would like to see all of our student groups tracking in the same way. So we'd like to see, for example, our English learners, our Hispanic, and our free and reduced eligible students to all be in that blue or green category to show that regardless of what student group you're part of, you are performing in the top 25% of states in the country. We think that's going to help us to be more accountable as a state agency, frankly, to ensure we are serving all students equitably. So it's going to be one focus area for us moving forward. Other questions on this, because I know it's a new chart. So if we look at, we're looking at the performance of our state compared to similar states. So one of the things that we've traditionally done is compared ourselves based on regional or geographic location as opposed to demographic composition. So we wanted to see what would Tennessee look like when we compared ourselves to states that had similar composition. So we looked at GDP per capita, our poverty index, and the population diversities, because that is what is known to be kind of the best mix of saying what are similar states. Our closest partner state is actually Indiana. We are almost identical when it comes to GDP per capita, when it comes to poverty index, and then when it comes to population diversity. We also see that Indianapolis is one of the more competitive states with Nashville. So we're seeing that in the business community as well. When we look at the performance, the next closest states are going to be Iowa, actually, has increased their diversity relatively recently over the last 4 to 5 years. Kentucky is our closest partner in terms of a state that is a border with Tennessee. But we've also seen a little bit with Missouri and North Carolina, though North Carolina's economy is slightly different than Tennessee's. And then Wisconsin is also close. When you look at that in 4th grade NAEP, we're going to be the red dotted line just to make it slightly easier to see. You can see Tennessee was floating below that clump of states together. In 2011 to 2013, you've seen that that's bumped up quite a bit. We are now much more competitive with those states. Though when it comes to 4th grade reading, we are still below those states that are most demographically similar to us. When you look at 8th grade NAEP for ELA, you see similar trends. We were much farther below those partner states. We had the big bump between 2011 and 2013. We've then kind of floated, had a little bit of a dip and recovered. We are now, we're still tracking pretty below some of our closest partner states, although we have surpassed Missouri. And I think that trend-wise, we'd like to see some of the efforts that we want to put towards literacy to bump that back up. There's just more of a spread in 8th grade than what we see in 4th grade. Unfortunately, across the country, 4th grade continues to be an area of significant need. And then the last slide specific to NAEP is around math data. So again, we're the red line. It's the same peer groups. We were much closer linked in fourth grade math over time. Again, we had the big bump between 2011 and 2013. We got super competitive specifically with North Carolina, and we've floated just under some of these competitive peer states since then. We think that the bump and the trend line of how we're progressing now is going to put us much closer. We're still going to be pretty far away from what we're seeing in terms of, Indiana and North Carolina on the top. We're going to be, we're several percentage points from them, about 12 percentage points. When you look at 8th grade math, again, as with 8th grade ELA, it's not uncommon. You're going to see more of a spread as students move through their education experiences. Those experiences then and their achievements just going to spread over time. And so we continue to see that. We are above Kentucky and just below Missouri. Questions on those comparison states or how we're thinking about looking at the data to position Tennessee?
Mr. Eby?
Yeah, and I apologize because this was going so fast, and I haven't had a chance
Yes, sir.
to review this. We're just getting this. But when I look at your graduation rates, and it looks like that Tennessee is, if I read this correctly, above quartile 3. They're in the top 75 to 100% of graduation rates. And yet, on the other hand, we're not in the top 75 in our academic scores. So is that telling us something that we brag about our graduation rates, but is that the real metric we want to be using?
So yes, we want to use that metric because I think it does put our students on a different path. And I would say, yes, we need to take a very critical look about what our diplomas mean. So I think that's why we're using language like graduate with a diploma that means something. The truth in advertising goes also to the truth in advertising to our students. If our students graduate with a diploma from a Tennessee high school, we want to make sure that that diploma means that they are ready to enter whatever post-secondary opportunities or workforce opportunities they choose, and that they are ready to do so, and that they know what their readiness level is. What we're seeing is that attainment, remediation, and some of the things that we're tracking do not necessarily track with the percentage of students who are earning a diploma. Many of our students are still requiring remediation services. Certainly, if we only have 27% 8th grade reading proficiency, we're probably not tracking for over 90% graduation rates. It's something that I think continues to be, and it's not just in Tennessee, this is nationwide, a real struggle when we think about our school system. How much do we withhold a diploma, which has so much value in terms of next phases of opportunities for our students? So what is that level that we hold it to versus kind of that truth-telling of readiness? And part of that is we have to make sure we're being really honest with our students and our graduates about what potential opportunities they still have to get to the point where they'll be successful in whatever they choose after high school.
Yeah, I agree that our goal is to prepare our students for success and career in life. But then when we say that we're graduating almost 90%, and that looks like that we're in the 75 to 100% quartile, and then yet we're in the below 50th in academics, and we brag about graduation rate. I just think that we ought to be looking at what is the right metric we ought to be looking at.
I agree with you, sir.
Mr. Edwards?
So, Commissioner, just to continue Bob's, and my math may be wrong, but out of 76,000 graduates in Tennessee, if I'm looking at the ACT numbers correctly, 33,000 cannot read adequately to be successful in post-high school training. And that also includes the military. 33,000, and that's an annual throw. That's year in and year out. I'm with Bob. I'm very unimpressed with that level of that honor of the graduation rate. And I fear when we look at how much damage that may do to hold them back, nothing's going to do more damage than as soon as they walk across that stage, they're dead in the water.
Yes, sir. I think that's something that we're we're going to continue to look at. One of the things that's going to be critical is making sure that when we're looking at our earliest grade levels, that we start our students on a path to success as early as possible. So we're really going to be focusing, and you'll see that in the strategic plan, on early literacy, making sure that there's a strong foundation there, really focusing and drilling down on third grade literacy. We think that by the time we hit high school, we're spending so much time catching up and trying to fill holes. That's not actually the work that we need to be doing in high school. Students need to be so well prepped in those early foundation years that they're taking advantage of the incredible opportunities that our Tennessee high schools offer to them. And if they don't have a solid foundation reading specifically, that's going to be incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what we've been saying, we need to hit it in the early grades. And that's the right long view. There is a short, though, view that there are people that are already in the continuum that have passed that third grade deal that we have a responsibility for getting out ready to go. So we need to kind of be ambidextrous.
Yep. Yes, sir.
And I think you originally shared with me, too, that you were looking at the Mississippi model and what they are doing there, because they are a model to follow from everything that I've seen since you shared that information with me. So are you working with folks there? Just what are you doing in regard to that? Because I know you're dealing with a lot of other issues, and so I just wanted to see if you could share what your plans are there.
Yeah, and if I can, we'll be diving into that in the strategic plan. So we'll spend a great deal of time on that model.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So kind of to finalize some of our proficiency data in the K-12 space, we wanted to give a sense of overall combined proficiency. It was one of the questions that came our way. So this looks at, in 3rd through 8th grade, the percent of students who are proficient in both English language arts as well as mathematics. Overall in the state, that's 26% are proficient in both. When you look at students with disabilities, that's 9.1%. Black, Hispanic, Native American combined together is 14.5%, economically disadvantaged is 13%, and English learners are 3.2%, to give you a sense of what that breakdown is. So now we're going to move to ACT and AP, assuming there aren't other questions on proficiency in the K-12 space. So looking at ACT performance at 2 checkpoints. So first, we look at the final highest average performance. We've seen that the amount of savings in terms of those students who use the retake is pretty significant, and we'll look at that graph in particular. We also saw that more people and more students are taking advantage of the ACT and the ACT retake opportunities that Tennessee offers, which is, I think, a model for the country and lots of people are looking at. We have seen that there has been a 4-year decline in 11th grade performance, and we'll look a little bit at that in a minute. But first, and I think most importantly, the ACT 12th grade retake is showing, number one, that we've seen an increase in the percent improvement for those students who take advantage of retake, and certainly the return on investment is quite high. So for every $1 spent, there's a $5.69 return on investment, which is significant for our students. It opens up scholarship opportunities for students who otherwise wouldn't have those opportunities, and I think it also encourages students to take advantage of a pathway that they might not have considered otherwise. And so this is, I think, a huge advantage for the state. Second is if we look at cohort performance from 11th to 12th grade, what you will see, especially looking at the class of 2017 to 18 and 18 to 19, is that increase again in score between the first take and then the retake. So you see a pretty significant, approximately a 1-point jump for those students who are able to do that, and that is significant in terms of opening up opportunities. Again, senior retake has allowed about 1/3 of the 2019 graduating class to increase their highest composite score. Very
Commissioner, would
positive.
you refresh my memory on where the funding comes from for the retake?
It's state dollars, so we ask for that.
That's not in the BEP, is it, Nathan? It's a separate funding, right? Yep.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so when we look at 11th grade statewide performance, the graph on the left is the 11th grade ACT average score over time. On the right, it's participation and the percent meeting the college-ready benchmarks. So on the left, again, you can see ELA is in the gold, math is in the orange, reading is in the red, and then you have science in all. You see a pretty significant bump between 2015 and 16. And then you see, again, what is pretty typical, and you see as kind of a maintenance and performance, a slight decline across the state. It's something we are looking at. I think combining 11th and 12th grade, we do want to be able to see 11th grade to 11th grade apples to apples. It helps us to get in front of data and be proactive in supporting our high school students. Similarly, when you look on the right, you can see a similar trend. We had some increases between 2015 and 17, and then you've had a maintenance and performance over time. And that's, again, students who are meeting the College Ready benchmark and looking at participation. Participation is in that light blue in the back, significant increase, maintenance of performance. This is another way to look at it, just for kind of visual differentiation. So again, big celebration point is the significant increase in participation rates that we've seen as a state. In 2015, we're looking at just under 52,000 students who were able to participate at an 18.7 performance. In 2016, that jumped just about 4,000 students to 56,000. You also saw a commensurate increase at a 19.2 for that score. 2017 had the largest increase in performance. We went from 56,000 to just over 65,000. And we had a maintenance in performance, which is a big deal to be able to increase by almost 10,000 students and then also not have a decline in scores, which is what many states see. So I think a massive celebration point. Where we want to spend some time as a department really zeroing in and focusing is what's happening between 2017 and 2019. You can see between 2017 and 2018, we had a slight increase of about 1,000 students, and we had a decrease of 0.3. And then between 2018 and 2019, we had another decrease of about 1,500 students, and we went from an 18.8 to an 18.7. So what you could see across 2015 to 2019 is essentially maintenance of performance with a significant increase, but from a trend data line, we're trying to make sure that the 11th grade to 11th grade apples to apples, that we're not continuing to see a decline in performance between those cohorts. And then last, this was an interesting request that we got, and so we were excited to be able to look at this. This is the 10-year AP pass and performance change when compared against all states. So what you can see on the vertical axis is the change in passing rates. The middle lines on these are both the medians when you look at the state performance. You can also see in the upper left-hand corner, that's going to be states who improve their performance while increasing their participation just a little. On the bottom left, it's going to be those who had lower performance and increased participation a little. And then obviously in the green on the right, you're increasing participation a lot and a significant increase in performance. What's important to note is that every state in the country increased participation in AP. So that's something that has been standard across the country. We're looking at where Tennessee ranks, and we're obviously kind of the big dark line just to the left and down of center. And then there's a big cluster of states that are right kind of opposite or kitty corner to where we are. And that's where most of our similar or peer states are. You see a couple of outliers in the upper left or upper right hand, and that's going to be District of Columbia, Florida, and Maryland. You see a few states that are lower than we are, which is Iowa, Idaho, and North Dakota. It's really hard to compare ourselves to the lower right-hand box, which are going to be states who had worse performance but increased participation a lot, again, because you would expect that. But those are going to be Louisiana, Rhode Island, and Alabama.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Yeah.
How different do you think this would look if we were including dual enrollment and dual credit as opposed to just AP?
There's no way to do that because the policies on those are so different. Some states don't have kind of local agreements, so some states don't have that. So there's no way to make the policies align in terms of opportunities. AP is the only apples to apples where we've seen increase in participations across the country. There are some states who don't have those dual enrollment opportunities at all. We could look at outcomes if all states had some similar P20 data systems. The strongest states for that tend to be the very, very large states who can afford kind of that mass data collection for students up to the age of 26. But since there's not really an apples to apples, this is the best kind of standardized way to look at the data.
That's what I figured. It would just be interesting because I would think like in District of Columbia, which again, I think we should be looking to as a model, they probably don't have a lot of the same dual credit, dual enrollment. But at the same time, we need to be in the green too, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Still
Absolutely.
representative.
Yep,
Agreed.
thank you. Any other questions?
Okay. So we're going to move away from proficiency and achievement data and look at our whole child and educator data. So first and foremost, we're looking at youth mental health in Tennessee. So this is of the 50 states. So before we look at the rankings, I want to be able to give some context to that. So if we're talking 2, 3, 4 years ago, most of those are going to look like we were in the 40s. So the change in terms of improvement has been positive for the state. We were actually 50th, 49th, and 48th in a couple of these metrics. So we've seen significant improvement in that space. I know we don't want to be anywhere in the 30s. We'd like to be somewhere very, very different for our students, but I think the trend of where we're heading has been in the positive direction. But we are 38th in overall mental health for our students, 39th for youth experiencing severe mental health. And then I think one of the things that we are most concerned about is 46 for students identified with emotional disturbance for an IEP. That's something we heard a lot about from our educators in terms of needing additional supports. And so that's something that I think we're spending a lot of time looking at. Again, the dark blue in terms of the color coding of the states are going to be those that are the lowest ranked. The gold is going to be those that are the most positively ranked.
How are we measuring that?
Yep, so this, Sure. So these tend to be self-reported by health agencies and social service agencies from every state, and it's collected by a centralized data system at a national level. So these are some quick data points. Again, these were some requested data points from us. This is all CDC data. This is going to be self-reported, so you can assume with anything self-reported across states, and since many of these are students who are self-reporting, we assume it's going to be slightly under-reporting. But students who had access to drugs at school, what we saw is a sharp increase in Tennessee between 2011 and 2013, and then essentially a plateau from there. Nationally, we're seeing something similar. The increase happened slightly earlier, and then a plateau with a slight decline. This does not include vaping or smoking. We had that kind of as a follow-up question. This is another one that we're spending some time trying to dig into, but this is students bringing firearms to school. Again, this is going to be self-reported data, and it's the number of students per 100,000. So you see that's been pretty consistent over time nationally, but we did see an uptick between 2014-15 school year and the 2015-16 school year. We don't know why. We've looked into policies, what might have changed in particular to see that. But we are spending a lot of time trying to figure out what the source of that information might be. And again, it is student reported. That's going to look different across, and so just take that for what that data says.
So where is this reported?
The
You say it's
CDC.
self-reporting. Is it reported to the department?
It's not reported to the department. The CDC collects the data.
Okay, you do say that. I'm
Mhm.
sorry.
Oh, of course.
Is there any way to, because to tackle the issue, you have to know what you're dealing with, and is there any data related to the specifics, any cause and effect? What you said there's none of that.
No, so the CDC essentially just reports what is self-reported to them, and then they give us that data. What we're trying to dive into is, were there any significant policy changes at the state level? Were there any federal policy that might have impacted Tennessee differently? We're also trying to dig into what this data looks like specific to every other state to see if there are other states that have similar trends and if there was something that was happening in that region of the country. So this is pretty new data for us. We haven't really looked at it this way as a department, so we will certainly be reporting back, because this was one that nobody wants to see.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. And then this is, I think, really positive data for Tennessee in terms of trends. So the middle kind of red line is going to be where the United States is, and it gives you the differential on either side. The red line in the middle is going to be the median. We are the blue. We had that uptick quarter after quarter, and these are the last 9 quarters. And then we started to see a decline. We think a lot of that has to do with there's been more in-school programs specific for anti-bullying measures. We think that there has been some really strong traction of that in our schools. And then I know you've seen this data before, but wanted to reinforce some of our teaching data. There are so many different places that kind of quote unquote rank what the quality of being a teacher, or the best states to be a teacher, et cetera. We chose to go with Ed Week because that is kind of the journal that most of our educators either subscribe to or read. And so the way they looked at it had to do with quality of pension systems, competitiveness of getting a job, salaries, but essentially the quality of life that one could have from the full trajectory of starting to be a teacher to retirement and then post-retirement. In that case, 41st. In other cases, we've been as high as the top 25. So it really does vary quite a bit depending on what you're looking at. But we did want to highlight specifically how many teachers are spending a great deal of time looking for materials. So we're seeing that 1 in 5 teachers spend more than 10 hours per week, and that's just sourcing instructional materials. That's not even doing the plans, it's just looking for things to teach with. 69% spend more than 4 hours a week. So if you think about that, that's 45 minutes to an hour, Monday through Friday, just looking for things to teach the next day or the next week. We think that teachers should not be spending time doing that. They should have what they need on day one. We also think that, some of the concerning data around only 5% of college students consider education as a profession, down from 27% in the 1970s. When we look at the shortage data, when we look at districts who are desperately trying to fill mission-critical positions, we have to make sure that we encourage people to go into the professions. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about that.
Yes, Mr. Edwards?
We talk a lot about this, and this puts numbers to it, but intuitively we had that sense. What we don't know is what to do about it. And we certainly are open to help the state, the department in any way we can to cure some of these problems.
Well, stay tuned for 15 minutes, we're gonna get there.
All right.
I don't think it's gonna solve all of our problems, but I think with the strategic plan, these are things that we are absolutely hoping to address. It is gonna take partnership between the department, the state board, the legislature, and certainly the larger administration from Governor Lee to be able to really say that we want Tennessee to be the only place in the country anyone would possibly want to teach. We are that strong and good, and that is what we're aiming for. But it is gonna take strong partnership, I think some really challenging, difficult conversations, but we know that there's nothing more important to a student's education than the teacher in the classroom. So if that is true, and we know that to be true, then we would like to ensure that we are treating the profession and our educators at the elevated kind of level of celebration. Certainly compensation is part of that. But we are thinking about how do we get more people into teaching. It is the greatest profession I've ever been a part of, but not enough of our students are getting exposed to that joy. So that is, I want to take a pause because that is kind of the summary of the data. We're happy to get you any additional data slides. I know it was kind of fast and furious. We have limited time and want to make sure you get the strategic plan. We will send you additional data slides on any of these. I know Sarah and I talk regularly, so if you want to send her data requests, we're happy to get you any of those slides. I can also hop on the phone with anyone at your convenience to talk through more of the data points that are most interesting to you.
You ready to proceed?
I am.
To your next,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay, so strategic plan. So Best for All is our new strategic plan. We rolled it out to the educator group that was at the LEAD conference last Tuesday, and are excited to talk a little bit more about the direction to address some of the data that we just had the opportunity to discuss. So in order to create the plan, we went about it a slightly different way. So we did not kind of create a structure of a plan and then put it out for public comment. In this particular development of the strategic plan, we decided to hear from people, hear what our districts, our teachers, our families, all of our education community was looking for, then create a draft, put it back out for feedback, and then go from there. So first we had a listening tour. We'll talk a little bit about that data, but lots of classroom visits, lots of conversations with district stakeholders to be able to hear directly from our community about what they were looking for to support the growth and the accelerated growth that we are hoping to see. We had an educator survey, and there was a specific open-ended question for every educator to answer. What would you like the department and the commissioner to know about what should go into the strategic plan? Over 25,000 comments from educators came in on that. I read every single one of them, and so I think it was very informative in terms of trends. I will say that this plan absolutely reflects the top 3 trends that we saw come through in that survey. And then lastly was public input. And I think going to the next slide, just to give you a sense of what all went into this, over 500 classrooms were visited. We had over 60 district meetings, and over 33,000 comments came in, and this is in about 4.5-month period. So all of those were considered and taken into account in terms of the development of the plan. So in terms of the strategic priority areas, so certainly with academic access, we heard quite a bit about this, but it was the focus on standards, assessment, evaluation, and turnaround. There was a clear sense that that had moved the state forward. How do we continue to solidify and strengthen and codify what that looks like over time? And so I think one of the things is how do we build and provide supports to help people implement at that highest level to meet the high expectations that have been set as a state over the last decade. Secondly, we heard a great deal about whole child outside of the BEP. This was the number one thing that our educators talked about. The extreme needs in terms of what the experiences in classrooms now, the needs of our students, which have changed dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. How are we providing supports for the whole child so that students have what they need to be able to access the excellent instruction that we are giving to them every day? And then third is around educators. And this, again, has to be, I think this is going to be a big part of our plan, but it's how do we ensure that we recruit, that we prepare, that we support, and that we elevate our teachers in a way that reflects the value that they have in terms of providing all of our children with access to the best possible education. And that's going to be, I think, a pivotal point of this strategic plan. So some of the reflections that we had, just to share what we heard more broadly. So when we talked to students, all of them talked about their favorite teachers. We said, you know, what do you like about school? 9 times out of 10, it wasn't recess and lunch, which everyone expects to hear, especially from elementary school. That was always kind of second and third, tied for silver and bronze. But the gold was always, you know, Miss McDonald or Mr. Jones really cared about me, or that's what it would sound like, or, you know, Miss McDonald loves me. When you got into the high school, it was always this teacher or that teacher really pushed me, or they believed in me, or they let me know that I could do whatever it is that I wanted. So the high expectations really translated for our high school students. It wasn't the teacher that let them off the hook, it was the one who believed in them enough to push them. When we talk to our principals and when we go into classroom visits, and I've had the opportunity to be on some classroom visits with some of you, I think we had a particularly fun one at an elementary school. But what we heard from our principals is they were so excited to take us to their strongest classrooms and say, you'll never believe what our teachers are accomplishing with our students. And so hearing that pride and joy in terms of what teachers were accomplishing came through in our principals. And then when we talked to families, they always talked about a teacher who changed the lives of their children, and in some cases their entire families. And so thinking about the impact that our educators have, not just on the students between 7:30 and 2:30 every day, but the impact that they have on generations, I think is something, again, we need to elevate the profession and continue to, I think, talk about it and support it in a way that I think our stakeholders are saying they value very much. So from a vision, I talked a little bit about this, but our vision is, again, thinking more about what is the point and purpose of K through 12 public education. Is it to ensure that we hit a test score, or is it to ensure that our students are equipped to take advantage of whatever dreams and pathways they've set for themselves? So our vision is to set all students on a path to success, and that's for whatever they choose for themselves. So we're thinking about how do we measure that. So from an end goal perspective, we're measuring that for what happens 2 years after they graduate from high school. So we believe that, again, I think we liken it to parents, but that idea of your children graduate from high school, they go off to college, they get a job, they go wherever they're going to go, and you hope that you've done right by them, that they can take care of themselves and provide for themselves. It's the same thing in K through 12 education. If we've really done our job in pre-K 12, have we then equipped them to be able to take advantage of the incredible opportunities that are in front of them? We want to measure that 2 years after graduation, and that would be 2-year college persistence, that would be TCAP, that would be military enlistment, and that would also be like a high-wage job. There's a number of our students who will be eligible to go straight into employment because we have so many high school TCAP partnerships, for example. But again, we want to make sure that our students can create the dreams and goals for themselves, and we've equipped them to be successful on those pathways. So we have 3 general pillars or priorities in the strategic plan. The first is in academics. We want all students in Tennessee to have access to a high-quality education no matter where they live. That's rural, suburban, urban, or according to NAEP, town Tennessee, which is our new favorite term internally. But we also want to make sure that we have whole child so that our schools are equipped to serve the academic and the non-academic needs of all students. That does not mean that it is the teacher in the classroom who is serving the non-academic needs. It means that we have equipped our schools to have the resources to serve those needs, because we know right now, whether or not we like it, whether or not we think it is the role of the school, we have our students for the majority of their waking hours for 13 years. So if that is the case for the majority of our students, we have to make sure that they're fed, they have what they need to be able to access education, and the education we're providing for them. And so many of our teachers are saying right now those needs are not being met. And then with educators, again, this is our moonshot. Tennessee will be the #1 place in the country to become and remain an educator. We want everyone in the country to say there's no possible place I could think about teaching other than Tennessee. That's what we would love every single teacher in the country to say. We're going to get there. So for strategic priority 1, academic access, we have essentially 3 big bucket areas that we've pulled out a little bit into 4 for the purposes of this presentation. But the first, I think, Chairwoman, to your point, is early literacy supports and what that looks like. So for early literacy supports, we want to invest in a coherent and proven set of resources and supports for all of our schools. That looks like ensuring that every single early literacy teacher has access to high-quality materials based in the science of reading. We want to make sure, again, we know the teacher is the most important thing that's in front of a student every day. The second most important thing are the materials that child learns with. So we want to ensure in the earliest grades they have access to the highest quality materials. We want to make sure that there's support for using those materials. And again, that starts as early as in our educator prep programs, but that our teachers are getting the coaching and support necessary to really teach in the science of reading. And then we also want to make sure that we can purchase, use, and report on a common diagnostic. One of the challenges, again, not having standardized tests and it not being appropriate for the youngest grades, is there isn't a common measure. So the first time we really get a statewide stick of how our students are doing is going to be in 3rd grade. By then, it becomes very, very difficult. We're playing catch up. So how do we kind of replicate the best practices that we've seen in the District of Columbia and in Mississippi? One of the things that those states did is they said, districts did, was that we are going to have a coherent, comprehensive suite of supports. It can't just be pilots. It has to be that this is the way we're doing it. We're using high quality materials. We're giving our teachers everything they need to successfully teach those materials and support students. And we have a way to measure progress along the way. And we're going to do it with fidelity, and we're going to provide the level of resource necessary to ensure that all teachers feel like they have what they need. So we think that that also extends to what happens at home, and so we want to have family reading guides. It's again something that I think Mississippi integrated quite well into their program to ensure that for those parents who are able to provide that time for reading at home, spending time together, they had the resources that connected back into the classroom. So we had a public budget presentation last Friday. The department is asking for $15 million recurring for our literacy work statewide. That's proportionally about what you saw in Mississippi. Given the cost of living is higher in Tennessee, we're looking at what that could be, but it does allow for a certain dollar per student to support this work. Questions on literacy? Next is high-quality instructional materials. So again, the importance of high-quality instructional materials, knowing that after the teacher in the classroom, the materials are the second most important factor, and that makes sense. It's who's teaching, and then it's what you're learning with. We want to ensure that all of our students have access to high-quality materials, and our teachers, whether it's 69% or 20%, are not spending 4 to 12 plus hours a week looking for things to teach with. They need to be given the highest quality materials every single day of instruction, and then the supports needed to implement those. So we would like to have regional trainings and workshops. We have an ELA adoption, obviously, that's coming up. We would like to make sure that all of our districts have the opportunity to select high quality materials to use, and that they have local adoption processes that coach and help districts around what selection can look like, because we know those are local decisions in terms of purchasing. We want to support the implementation of those materials. We want to provide grant opportunities for districts who do adopt high quality materials so that they have the opportunity to support teachers in the implementation. What we learned from the math, and again, remember we saw that uptick in terms of math proficiency, one of the lessons learned is that when teachers had implementation support, they were more likely to use the textbooks or use the materials in front of them and use them with fidelity. It is going to be much, much higher with English language arts. What we've seen, especially in the elementary school space, is that is a more emotional and personal connection that teachers have to the content and the material. It's also harder to use new materials, and so we know that that support's going to be incredibly important. And then
Commissioner, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Nope, not at
I
all.
was just going to say, would you clarify with each of these, because I should have asked some questions earlier, but I thought, we'll get to a stopping point and I'll ask this, but I'll ask it now. And if you could, going forward, indicate to us where the funds are coming from, and if you've put into your budget request funding, recurring funding for each of these, because clearly these are, I think everybody would say they're absolutely in agreement with you, but again, the reality of making it happen. So I'd be interested to know, as you go along, have you asked for funding for each of those and all the, of course you have, but I want to make sure there's no assuming, and do you have a high degree of confidence that you will receive it? And then I have a timeline question, which I'll ask you later.
Those are wonderful questions, and I will answer some of them. So,
Okay.
we certainly have what this could look like. We'll know the governor's budget and what he proposes in January with the state of the state. We have a variety of levels of implementation. So anything that we're presenting today, we can certainly do at a pilot level if we do not receive funding for it. And then certainly if and when the governor decides that this is what he wants to present in his budget and the legislature then adopts that budget, we would have a better idea of the scale and scope. The one thing, so I'll provide the dollar amounts for those things that were requested in our public budget. And so right now the $15 million for the literacy supports we put in our public budget. High quality instructional materials, what we absolutely will be doing and can do is support for the adoption, and then we can do smaller grants for implementation pending any budget allocation.
Okay.
But I'll be sure to annotate that each time. And then the last bullet on high quality materials is just we know that there has to be a connection between standards, materials, and assessment. And right now those are pretty separate. So we do standards trainings, and then separately we have adoption, and then separately we have assessment. And we think there needs to be a flow through between all three for teachers to feel that they can use the materials seamlessly and coherently. Next is innovative assessments. This is something that I think the department will be moving forward with. So we have a small budget ask that we put into the budget this year relative to the size of the assessment contract. But we believe that one of the things that must be true is that all of our teachers should know that the materials they're using are leading to success on whatever we're measuring on our TCAP. So what this allows us to do is to take the assessment items that we own, and remember, Tennessee is one of the last states who actually owns their assessment items. Many are using a consortia or they're leasing items from some kind of bank. We develop, create, and then own our own items. Given that that's the case, we can use those items to create free formative and interim assessments that our districts can use. That means they are no longer spending $6 to $24 per student to purchase those assessments that are have varying levels of alignment with our TCAP. They would have those for free with the same data analytics capabilities. They can print the same reports. We can actually make it kind of much more responsive to what the districts and parent needs are in terms of what that reporting looks like. And we can do that essentially at no cost to the districts. It would be a minor scale cost at the state. We would like to do that for formative assessments and interim assessments. We would also like to align those to the high quality materials. Again, so teachers have the materials and now they have interim and formative assessments aligned to the materials they're actually using. And then on top of that, we can have a bank so teachers and districts can create their own assessments if they so choose. And again, data analytics capacity and capabilities for all of these things that we would like to be able to roll out to districts. It was one of the more positive things from the superintendent conference that we had in September. Pretty universal agreement that this would be a positive, both cost savings and then add value to our local districts.
Question.
Yes, sir.
What would be your timeline for that? I know as those are released, the bank will build. So would you see that in a year, 2 years, 5 years?
Yeah. So my timeline is always different than the team's timeline. So I'm like, oh, tomorrow, let's just get it done. But I think in reality, what we're looking at is that we are developing what we call testlets, or we'll take a couple of grade levels and content areas. We will be able to have those ready and up by August. Next year would essentially be a pilot year where we'd be able to test those out, get a lot of feedback to say, what does the data reporting look like? What are the types of reports and graphs you need? How do we have the user experience to be more effective? We can determine what the PDF version versus the online version looks like, et cetera, et cetera. Once we get that feedback next year, we would be able to roll out a full suite for math and ELA the following year. So that would be in the 21-22 school year. And then I think from there, we would like to be able to say, now we're aligning all of those to the instructional materials. We would do that kind of ranking who uses what materials are used the most. We would start there and then move down. So we're looking at first year beta pilot, second year generic rollout, and then every year after that expanding the base. We would expect a full kind of complete set within 5 years.
If that truly happens along that timeline, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions, for our bigger systems that could be saved.
Oh, yeah,
That's
statewide,
gonna
it
be
would be
huge.
millions of dollars, yep. And all of those funds can then be used for things like literacy coaches, additional teachers, teacher compensation, et cetera. But that's where we think, when we look at the role of the state, we do think this is the kind of project that is the right role of the state. It is saying we can build something at scale that our districts can then use for free and not spend money on things that they're doing individually. We shouldn't buy the same thing 147 times when we can actually create it once. And we did write this into our current RFP that's currently in place.
Continue.
So finally, under academic access is career exploration. So again, this is ensuring that every student has access to career exploration in the early grades. What we heard from our students directly is that high school is just too late to start to figure out what they like and what they're good at. They want to be able to do that in the earlier grades, so then when they're on a pathway starting in 9th grade, it's towards something that they actually want to do after they graduate. And too many students said things like, I'm a sophomore, and I realized I really don't like this pathway, but I'm already starting to earn credits, and I don't want to lose the credits, so I'm just going to keep on keeping on, so I can get some more credits to save some money in college. It would have been so much more helpful to do it earlier. So we want to be able to fund pre-K through 8 career exploration, give students an opportunity to expand even what they know to be true about possible careers, and then create high school models and programs and innovative high school models and programs so that all students, regardless of where they live, have a pathway that is aligned to what they're interested in and what they're good at. And we think that for our rural communities and some of our smaller systems in particular, there's too much limitation. There isn't necessarily the same opportunities as you might have in the bigger systems. So we are looking at models across the country, and there are a number where small and rural districts have created consortia together to create a unified high school. The big barrier to that ends up being accountability, because then how do you piece apart a school who quote unquote owns the data? So we're looking at ways where we can still say it's most important to get students opportunities to have high quality high school opportunities and pathways, and then we have to figure out how to allow some of our smaller systems to create those so that all students have equitable access.
When you say unified high school, would you help clarify what you mean by that?
Sure, so what we can see is that you might have 4 rural counties together, and between them, and I'll use one not to be named high school in particular, they have graduating class of less than 100 students. And so all 100 of those students, some want science, some want APs and English language arts, et cetera. They don't have the funds or scale to be able to fund all of those rigorous courses or pathways. So if you take 4 or 5 of those high schools and create some kind of consortium model where they can feed in, together they can afford multiple teachers. You can use online teaching, et cetera. So we want to be able to think innovatively so districts don't feel like they have to operate alone. They can work together to create more opportunities for more students.
That's what I thought you meant, but I wanted to be sure I understood, because I've been a part of lots of conversations centered around that with some rural districts that I have an opportunity to work with. And they talk about the barriers, and so obviously you want the solution to come from that. So that's what I was curious to know about that. There are some pockets, just so you may not be aware of it, but you might, because some of your people that work in this particular space under Pathways, they're actually working with some smaller counties that are doing some phenomenal work, and I'm fortunate enough to work with them. So if you haven't had an opportunity to learn about those, I would suggest that we need to bring you in and have a site visit for some of those districts that are doing phenomenal things thanks to their partnerships with TCAT and the community college. So.
Yeah, that's
Make
right.
sure.
And I think your area in particular has been a highlight. And I would say all of these ideas are not ideas from the department. These are ideas that have come from the field. So I think that's been one of the benefits of having such a robust engagement process is we're saying great work is being done all over the state. Let's just figure out how to replicate and expand it.
Well, I will tell you, a lot of the work in the field has been propelled by the support of the state, so I don't want to discore the fact that they all did it by themselves, but there was some impetus because of Pathways with Jobs for the Future and Harvard, Pathways to Prosperity, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Questions on academic access?
Just a comment.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Hartgrove and I sat on the BEP review committee with Mr. James, who helps put that together. And one of our recommendations has to do with counseling services and providing additional funding to get something more consistent with what's recommended for counselors. How do we either hold the districts responsible, or how do we encourage the districts for the counselors to be counselors and not other activities? Because I agree with you here. I think it's very important for them to help students in the future, help them plan, what they want to be, how they want to do it, and how they're going to get there. How can we encourage that within our districts?
I'm going to answer that question. First of all, because I work with the counselors as well, the challenge always is, how do you have to provide them the professional development so that they know what that looks like. They don't know what employers want. They don't know what employers' needs are. So there really has to be a development process for the professional development materials to ensure that they know how to do it. And I believe that if they knew how to do that portion of their job, because they were not taught that in college, they didn't learn it there, and their director of schools or their principal does not know how to tell them how to do that. We actually conduct a summit every year and bring in counselors, and we put them in front of employers in the different sectors. But that's like a little nit. That's not even big enough to really impact this overall change. And I know we're running short on time, but I think it really has to do with professional development and giving them the tools, because they gravitate to what they're comfortable with, and they're comfortable with what they've been doing for years, literally.
I agree with what you say, but I think we also, the districts also have counselors doing things that aren't counseling services.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, because that's all they know. They're doing all the things that they know to do, which has nothing to do with, and some of them do, because I don't want to throw everyone, I don't even want to say throw them under the bus, because there are people who are doing great work in that counseling space, and they've done a phenomenal job. But there are those who have done all these other activities, and they keep gravitating back to them. So I think there needs to be training and materials to help them in that regard.
You all are previewing the next pillar, I believe.
Oh, sorry about that.
In terms of whole child. I mean, we heard that even this morning from districts, and I do think, again, as you mentioned, Commissioner, there's such a need for additional services to help with the non-academic needs. And it's got to be, I think, both, the counselors doing more of sort of what's truly counseling work, but also sort of a network of supports that goes beyond what the schools might be able to provide. But I do think this next pillar is going to speak to some of that, right?
Okay, thank you.
One thing about
Yes.
I had asked President of TEA to set up a conference call, I think he Skyped a conference call, with about 3 or 4 counselors from across the state, several who were either high school, middle school, or elementary school. And I'm happy to share my notes from this, about 3 pages worth of notes, with a lot of perspective directly from them to us about their needs and priorities and how they get pulled into some of these other areas. So I send those out to
Would you? That would be great. Thank you. Continue.
So that brings us to whole child, priority 2. And some of the things that I think to the certain questions and discussions we've had. So the first is on whole child. This is, I think, one of the broader components of the plan. And part of that is because as we went across the state, the term whole child and the definition varied pretty dramatically in each part of the state. And so one of our first big pieces of work is we need to define, when we say whole child, what do we actually mean? What is our common definition, at least from the state perspective? And it's building on the success of coordinated school health, and then saying, how do we expand and broaden that to ensure that we are serving whatever the needs are of the students, and certainly the needs that are new and very different than maybe what the needs were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so on this, our first step is really over the next 4 to 6 months is doing the needs assessment by specific areas, district needs, et cetera, across the state to determine what do people actually need. It's looking at what tools already exist in the ecosystem and what do we need to create. We have a number of other agencies where we think closer partnership and coordination would allow to bring resources into schools so that it wouldn't be up to the district to be the nurse and the counselor and the social worker and the police officer and the parent and everything else. The state isn't the parent, the school isn't the parent, but at the end of the day, we have to make sure that students are fed and that they have whatever needs are existing in the classroom addressed and supported so that they can access academic instruction. We do think there are existing agencies that we can closer partner with to provide those resources in real time for schools. And then identify more opportunities to increase those resources specifically in mental and behavioral health. We're seeing a lot of that across the system. What that gets to the earlier question is this idea of academic advising, and then what we see is kind of more general counseling, social work, et cetera. We think that there is a path for both, and right now, to some of the earlier questions and points, people are trying, sometimes you see the counselor doing more of the academic advising work, sometimes they're doing more of this whole child and whole supports work. And what we really need to do is make sure that both exist for students, whether that's career exploration in the younger grades or more academic advising in the older grades, but that we also have the additional needs that are being addressed. And part of that is we don't have great data. We need a better needs assessment to know how we continue to solve and address this.
Clarification, timeline, in this particular, your strategic plan, is it a 2019, 20, 2021, 5-year? What are we talking about? And do you at some point in time, whether it's done internally and you can share it with us at some future date, knowing more realistically what you expect in the way of timelines for each of these individual components under this? I'm accustomed to,
Yep.
You have your objective or your priority, and you have tactics underneath those, and those actions centered around the tactics or the action items, and the timing of those and the cost associated. So,
And none of that will be available until after the governor rolls out his strategic
Okay.
plan. So
Okay.
we've been very lucky that he's been generous enough to allow us to talk about this. All the other commissioners are going to have to wait till state of the state. So we operate on school years. So
Okay.
all of that will be available probably 24 hours after he rolls out his state of the state.
yeah, because then there could be some funding issues related to multiple.
And that's when we'd be able to say the size, the scale, and that way we could
Right.
finalize the metrics.
Okay.
Mhm.
Mr. Ferguson?
Commissioner, I could just comment.
Yes, sir.
Being in the healthcare world and being close to our school systems in Middle Tennessee, the whole issue of the mental health needs and the behavioral health issues, I think, is just becoming increasingly significant and difficult for everybody to deal with. And I don't expect any answers today or even from this plan, but I'm glad that this is on here in terms of looking at the whole child. But I think some of us would probably be shocked, Nick maybe closer to it than anybody, but just the tensions and the dilemmas that are faced in our schools. Unfortunately, it's getting younger and younger. It's not the middle school, high school, it's getting younger. And the information presented earlier about the behavioral health, I would say they were probably underestimated, because I really think it's a huge issue. So I'm glad that this is in here, and I do hope that there's a lot of good material beneath this that will really try and get to that problem.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so the next section is on character education. We heard a great deal, again, about the expenses of districts and certainly wanting to have something that was more Tennessee-specific that addresses some of the things that are as part of our standards. So specifically, financial literacy, and we know that there's an existing program, but how do we incorporate that existing program with our citizenship and civics work, aligning this up to a civic seal, and then certainly some of the personal characteristics. We heard this pretty clearly from our students, some of our post-secondary institutions and partners in our high schools, that many of our students, even if they are academically prepared, might not be prepared to be successful, either because they don't have the financial literacy and awareness, because they don't have some of the skills that are necessary to be successful post-high school graduation. And so how do we align some of that work? Again, Tennessee-specific, not something that districts would then have to purchase, and districts are having to make those choices about whether they're developing or asking teachers to develop that locally on top of other responsibilities, versus having at least a structure in place or a guidebook in place that they can start to implement some of these requirements. And then finally, we're looking at exceptionalities. We want to make sure that we are supporting all of our students with exceptionalities, thinking specifically about students with disabilities, but I think given the conversation today, would certainly also want to open that up to students who are English learners. We have tools for families and educators, and so one of the things that we're working to build, the timeline on this, and again, this is someplace where we do have existing funding sources. We are looking at a 2 to 3 year timeline, given the extensive nature of the tool that we would want to build online, and certainly the sensitivity of the information. but something to help our families and educators navigate what is a very, very complicated and complex process. If you're a family member and you're navigating some of the requirements, should you have a child identified with a disability, that can be very overwhelming, especially given kind of all the citations and very official letters that you get home. How do we make that easier and more manageable so families feel like they can genuinely engage? On the teacher side, 97% of our teachers have a child with a disability in their classrooms. And so if that's the case, we need to make sure that our educators have what they need to feel like they can support all of their students since they are being asked to do so. And not all of our districts have the capacity, certainly right now, to be able to provide those levels of support. So we're trying to figure out scalable ways to at least give some of those supports to teachers. Second is regional hubs. We have a lot of very small grants that are going to very specific initiatives. We think that that's really positive at the local level, and there is a space where the state can create resources, real-time resources for districts to use. We heard a great deal of feedback from our districts that said, look, we had a couple of students move into a school, especially in our small and rurals, and we don't have the supports, the staffing, the capacity necessary to be able to serve those children's need. We don't actually quite know what to do. So students aren't getting their needs met, and districts are scrambling to try to find solutions. If we had more regional hubs specific to some of our most common or growing exceptionality needs, districts would be able to call, get real-time support, short-term support, and then planning support to meet those needs of all of their students, especially, again, in our small and rural communities that might not have the existing capacity infrastructure in place. And then finally, we just know that we need to have stronger engagement opportunities across the state. It can't just be based in Nashville. We have to make sure that we're expanding that so that we are differentiating our support accordingly. And then lastly, we have educators in priority 3. We've divided that into 4 big buckets. The first is recruitment. There are a number of things on here. I would say for all of these, to the earlier question, we are moving forward on all of them. Size, scale, scope, and timeline is going to be, we are excited to roll out sometime in January, and so look forward to that. We'll just have kind of the constant rollout, and you'll see more of that in February at the next board meeting. But first, we're thinking about how do we create an advanced course for K-12. We know that there are seminal courses for lots of our pathways, so if we really are serious about teaching as a pathway, then how do we have advanced credit and courses that are available to our students to, again, elevate what it means to be a teacher and put people, again, just to signal to our high-performing students, this is a profession you should consider. You get post-secondary credit. Second is launching a teacher fellowship. How do we remove and reduce barriers for people going into the profession? So if we have a very high regarded fellowship that removes barriers such as college tuition, that removes barriers, the cost of credential, that allows for advanced programming and specialized programming, how do we get more people into the profession and remove barriers, especially for our highest performing students? I think all of you have been a part of or heard about the Grow Your Own that was recently launched, a partnership between Clarksville, Montgomery, and Austin Peay. It's incredibly exciting. You get your degree in 3 years. You get it for free, credentialing for free. You do 3 years. You are under a master teacher before your first day, and all that time you're getting paid healthcare benefits and years in the pension system. That is very different than many of our teachers now who went through their student teaching unpaid, worked jobs overnight. I don't know if that was your experience. And then we're starting the day one without having a significant amount of mentor-teacher experience. But imagine the difference for those students in that first-year teacher's classroom. I can tell you, my first year, I still think about those students and wish that I had done more and better for them. What could it have been if I had had 3 years under a high-performing mentor-teacher on day one? And then finally, we know that it is not just the department if we can't wave a magic wand and give everyone a raise, but we do think that it's going to be incredibly important that we continue to have comprehensive and aggressive conversations about educator compensation in the state. It's something that has come up a lot, especially over the last several months. It came up at the budget hearing on Friday, and we think it's an important time to have that conversation.
Mr. Edwards.
I glanced through these and didn't see it, so I'll raise it now, but if it's somewhere later, I apologize. Our makeup of state educators do not represent the demographics of our population of students, and we've got to mirror that if a lot of the successes we want. We got to recruit a lot of different people that are currently in public education. And again, it gets back to how we're going to do it.
Well, I think, so one of the things that I didn't mention is I think one of from a philosophical perspective, we think that is just how we should operate. So we don't want it to be a symbolic bullet. So if you're thinking about grow your own, one of the benefits that we think will happen is that we then will have a teaching population that can mirror. So removing financial barriers and obstacles, making it the pathway into teaching easier, we think opens it up and actually creates a lot more opportunity for a more diverse workforce. And then grow your own specifically, we think is going to be one of the greatest diversity plays, because if you have a student population that, let's say, is 25% children of color, you would expect to see a grow your own that would reflect that same population. And so it's a lot harder to try to create kind of targeted measures, but if we say, look, we're removing financial barriers and we're creating pipelines that reflect the communities in which we serve, without the financial barriers in place, both of those together we think is going to actually be one of our biggest wins in terms of increasing diversity. But that will be, you'll see that in every metric across this specific priority area, but completely agree with you. Okay. Preparation is another big one. I know this has been something that this board has talked a lot about over time, so I won't belabor this, but we are looking at educator prep innovation and leader prep innovation. That's kind of an ongoing conversation, certainly, that we've been having, with THEC, with State Board, et cetera. We want to continue those conversations. I know there's interest in how do we ensure that our leader preparation innovation is matching the strong work that's happened with Ed Prep. And continue to kind of push on what that looks like for all educators. And so more to come on that. I think you'll hear more about that potentially in the months to come. Pathways is next. Again, when we're thinking about our educators and the feedback, both from national data as well as Tennessee data, about what our educators are looking for, compensation is certainly there. We think about mental health and whole child supports is there. But third is just, what does it mean to be a teacher? And the idea that being in a classroom is both kind of your first day and your very last day in teaching, that there's no gray area or tiering in between. We think that we need to develop teachers as leaders and not say the best way to get greater compensation or feel like a leader is to actually leave the classroom and become an AP or a principal. That's the wrong message. We want to keep our exceptional educators in the classroom where they're impacting their students. And so we're thinking about things like Regional Teacher Leadership Network that would use our Teachers of the Year in each of our core regions year over year to create larger and larger networks of teacher leaders that can then go back and support one another in their schools. The data and research says that that is the most impactful way for teachers to grow and network, is to learn from one another. And so how do we encourage and collaborate and foster that level of collaboration between our teachers, especially utilizing our Teachers of the Year? We also think that there is some good work that we can do for articulated pathways for a Tennessee Master Teacher Network. We have a number of opportunities at the state where we're creating new things. We have teacher review committees for assessment items. We have review committees for instructional materials, for becoming a master or mentor teacher. How do we actually create tiers where we can provide additional compensation for teachers to come back and gain greater and greater skill sets in specialized areas? So you could be a Tennessee master teacher in assessment, or a master teacher in mentorship, or a master teacher in instructional materials, and allow for teachers to have both more leadership opportunities at the state level, get that expertise as we're developing materials, and certainly greater compensation. And then finally, we just think elevating the Teacher of the Year, making sure that they're a meaningful part of how we're making decisions and thinking about policy internally is going to be incredibly important. And then finally on this, we have a number of leadership networks. I'll go through these relatively quickly because there's going to be more to come in the months to come, but Rural Principal Network, we have a second cohort that will be launching in January on this. Aspiring Assistant Principal Network, we think it's important to not just have a principal in every building, but to ensure there is someone who's an instructional leader in every building who wakes up every day completely obsessed with academics and supporting teachers and instruction within the school. And so to ensure that we have that, we want to make sure there's a network where APs can be given the supports, resources, technical assistance, and training to be that exceptional instructional leader. And again, just focus on student achievement and instructional leadership every single day, all day. Principal Supervisor Network, again, if we focus just on the principal and don't think about the supports that happen between the principal and the teacher, we're missing something. In the same way, if we don't think about who's actually supporting and coaching the principals, who we know is an incredibly important part of teacher satisfaction, retention, and achievement in the school, we're missing something. So how are we supporting more principal supervisors? And then certainly thinking about Academy of School Leaders, looking at a turnaround principal cohort. We know how hard turnaround work is, and so how do we support those leaders who are doing that work? And then district leaders. We don't actually support many of our small districts those people wear lots of different hats. And so if we are not supporting our financial leads, our compliance leads, our communication leads. Again, we're missing some of the supports that we can do at capacity and at scale. And then final critical areas that are just part of the plan. These are what we call kind of the supporting work, increased engagement. We don't think that this should be a one and done. This should be a constant level of increased engagement. We should have a focus on turnaround work that's happening across the state, and certainly we've had a number of listening sessions over the last several weeks. School choice obviously is a big area of focus for us over the next several months and will be in the coming years. And then again, just greater district support. We've set the high expectation, we've set the high bar. That's the hard work that's happened over the last decade. And now the work has got to be, how do we help more districts and more schools meet that high bar? And that has to be through really differentiated technical assistance and support and a very district-focused lens. And then we can kind of skip to the very last because the theory of action just builds, but from a theory of action perspective, it's on a number of things. So certainly, again, we want to set up build on the foundations of assessment, high standards, evaluation, and school turnaround. We want to make sure that we give access to high quality academics for all students. We need to do that to ensure that the entire child is supported so they can access those high quality opportunities. And we can only do that if we have the human capital in the buildings who have been given the appropriate support, training, professional development, and preparation to be able to meet the expectations we're setting. And we have to do that through more capacity building at the district level and targeted technical assistance. And that can only be done if we have authentic, meaningful, and reflective engagement for all of our districts. And so I know that was a lot of information in the very small number of minutes that we could squeeze out here. But again, happy to have one-on-one conversations. This is when my speed talking actually can come into benefit, because I think I just made it under the wire. But happy to engage in any other questions that you have, or we can talk on the phone later.
Any remaining questions, comments? Mr. Eby.
Yeah,
All I have to do is look at him and
a lot of information, as you said, a lot of good data. I think the bottom line is going to be the results. So I know this is a 3 to 5 year plan or something like that, but we look forward to seeing as we go through the results that come out of it.
Thank you, sir. I hope so. And at the February meeting, what I can commit to is we will have the very formal plan that will be rolled out as part of the governor's state plan with very specific timelines, metrics, and expectations you can have of us.
And let me ask if we could get that, before we have
Yes,
a
sir.
meeting. That would be very helpful because.
Yes, sir.
I look forward to seeing that, and I thank you. I'm excited about what you've laid out, and of course, the proof is in the pudding, as you just said, and I'm saying it in different words. The funding, the resources, the human capital at the department as well as in the field to make this all happen. And so we'll be cautiously optimistic, or should we be aggressively optimistic? Mm-hmm. The other thing too, to Bob's point, I get distracted easily. And we were all scrambling to get the first part of your presentation, the NAEP part. So for me, I have to read it in advance. It's just there's so much going on, and whether you're the chair or you're not, it's really difficult sometimes to digest, and you did have to speak fast. Mm-hmm. So my request is, because I know you've got a lot on your plate, and I'm not trying to underscore that, but whatever you can do to get us all your presentation to us as quickly as possible. 5 days if we could, 10 days if we could, but 5 days, because you can tell, we pour over this. We care deeply about what is happening in the department and what you're suggesting and what the changes need to be, and we can weigh in a better way, in a more thoughtful way, with more time.
Yes, I will release that as soon as I am able to do that. So today this was.
No, I understand the circumstances today, and we appreciate you being here, and I know that you have to leave right after this because of other things happening. And so we know you cannot be with us tomorrow, and we certainly regret that.
I
We're looking
apologize
forward
for
to
that.
having you here, but hopefully we can see you in February. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for your work.
I think Ms. Kim.
We are getting ready to take a break. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Okay, so I admit I'm struggling to locate this within a broader context, like where we are in the process, because I'm sure I'm slow and I missed something, but we can talk about that offline. In terms of substance, like my overwhelming reaction, for what it's worth, is that I don't doubt, and this is feels good and right to me in the sense that if the lens is, it reflects what you heard in the field through many constituents, educators, parents, principals, districts. I don't doubt that this reflects like what the needs are. I think the thing I am as a board member struggling with is that, there's, 3 priorities, but each has like 3 to 4 strands. Plus there's this theory of action that includes foundation, supports, capacity, access, pipeline, engage. So it strikes me less as a strategic plan that articulates real priorities and more of a reflection of what you heard. And that may be unfair, but that's just my, and it could be, maybe it's just a lot coming at us. But as from a managerial standpoint, like I could pick apart any one of these, like innovative assessments alone, like to provide free state resources for formative assessments with TCAP questions aligned to high quality instructional materials, interim assignments aligned to annual TCAP, assessment bank of TCAP. That strand alone, right, because we've all managed big teams, 250 people at a time, and you can deploy them in different ways. That alone is a huge ask. And that's just one strand under one priority. And so that's just what it is. That's my take, is that it's what's really priority here, unless you're operating on a timeline that is like multi-years, which I'm getting the sense you are. Like you're thinking multi-years. It's not like we think this is going to turn on tomorrow. But the amount of work to be done at a high quality level it strikes me as astonishing. And so I love the ambition that's embedded, and I'm sure it does reflect like real needs, and I think then the hard work for all of us is just how do you prioritize? And I'm struggling a bit to understand like real priority when each one of these strands represents just so much work.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I would say is that each of the bullets under the priority areas, and there are 3 under each of the 3, so I think some of the work that when you're listing foundations, et cetera, all of that is theory of action. So there's 3 priorities, 3 bullets under each, so 9 essential initiatives that happen under this plan. Each of those has a pretty specific project plan with clear metrics and deliverables assigned to them. It also reflects the new organization chart. So each of the 3 priority areas is actually a chief who oversees that work. So there is someone who oversees human capital, someone who oversees academics. All of that work would fall under their shops, and each of the bullets represents one of our assistant commissioners who would oversee that priority area. For the assessment work, it's pretty, I would actually say that's one of the easier buckets in terms of organizing and working with a vendor who can do that. But I think in terms of what we've heard, this reflects both what we heard in the field, but it also reflects the data in terms of urgent need. But we've restructured the department to literally reflect this plan. So each assistant commissioner is essentially responsible for one of the 9 bullets. Engagement, authentic engagement, communications, some of that community and cohesion building is, I think, the way in which we do that work and operate. But each of these is a pretty clear project plan that's aligned to resources and metrics. So it's 9 essential big initiatives. But it is ambitious. We've got 27% of our 8th graders who are reading on grade level, so we feel a real sense of urgency to move forward, and I think over the next 4 to 7 years, we're hoping that we can make some real traction on some of those data points that we talked about.
Any other comments? Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 10-minute break. It's 3:06, and we'll come back at 3:16 promptly. Thank you.